Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today is Friday, February 27th, 2026, and we are doing something a little different today.
Yeah, we really are. It's a fun change of pace.
Usually when we sit down at these microphones, we are sorting through stacks of modern research papers or maybe analyzing some recent geopolitical history.
Mm,
But today we are literally unfolding a map.
a very old map.
Right. And I don't mean a map of a coastline or a city subway system or even a star chart. We are unfolding a map of reality itself.
It is a map of the soul, really. And when you say unfolding, you mean that quite literally. The source material we're looking at today is William Perkins's work. It's called A Golden Chain.
Right.
It was originally published around 1591, with major editions following in 1600. And usually when we talk about books from the 1500s, we think of dense walls of text.
Because an impenetrable Latin or something.
Exactly. But this wasn't just a text. It contained a massive, complex, fold-out diagram.
I was looking at the digital scans of this thing in the source files, and complex is a massive understatement.
It's overwhelming at first glance.
It really is. It looks like a cross between a frantic subway map and a wiring diagram for a nuclear power plant, or like a giant metaphysical family tree. You have this circle at the very top labeled God, and then these thick black lines dropping down. They split into different paths, reconnecting circles within circles.
It's intricate.
If you put this on a wall today, people would think you were trying to solve a conspiracy theory.
They absolutely would, but it had to be intricate. You have to remember the context here. This is the Elizabethan era. This is a time before modern psychology, before the Enlightenment, before we had scientific explanations for why crops failed or why plagues swept through towns.
Or why some people just seem to snap mentally.
Right. People were desperate for order in what felt like a chaotic, terrifying universe. They didn't have self-help books, they didn't have therapists, they had theology. And William Perkins, who was an absolute giant of his time, decided to visually diagram the science of the soul.
And he calls this chart an ocular catechism, which is a great phrase, but let's unpack that for you listening, because it sounds a bit like an eye exam.
Yeah. Ocular meaning for the eyes, so visual. And catechism meaning a tool for teaching the basics of the faith. We have to remember that literacy, while it was improving in the late 16th century, it wasn't universal.
Far from it.
And even for the literate abstract theological concepts like predestination or justification, they are incredibly hard to grasp if you just hear them spoken.
Especially if you're just a normal person sitting in a pew.
Exactly. Perkins wanted something that even the unlearned could look at. He wanted them to trace the lines with their finger to understand their destiny. He wanted them to see the links visually.
Hence the title, A Golden Chain. The imagery there is really strong. It implies an unbreakable sequence of cause and effect. It's not a golden rope that might fray or a golden path you can just wander off of. It is a chain.
That is the core premise. Perkins believed that nothing in the universe is accidental. Not a sparrow falling, not a king rising, and certainly not the eternal destiny of a human soul.
Every single human life is the result of a specific link in a chain that was forged by God before the foundations of the world.
Everything is connected.
That sounds incredibly comforting in one sense, right?
Yeah.
That there's a plan, that chaos is just an illusion. It tells you that you are just drifting in a void.
Yes, but as we are going to see today, it is also terrifying depending on which line of the chain you find yourself standing on.
Right. It is the ultimate high-stakes map. It charts the two possible destinies of every human being who has ever lived. And our mission today is to start exploring it. This is going to be part one of a three-part series.
We're taking our time with this one.
We have to. We are going to trace the lines on this chart to understand how the Puritans viewed the architecture of the universe. And today specifically, we are forcing ourselves to look at the right side of the chart.
The path of reprobation, the path of destruction.
It's the dark side of the map. But before we get into heavy theology, and it does get heavy, we have to talk about the man himself, William Perkins. Because reading his bio in the source material, he wasn't exactly born a saint. You'd expect the guy who drew this highly rigid logical chart to be a lifelong monk or some scholar who never left the library.
Far from it. Perkins eventually became the father of Puritanism. He was a Cambridge academic whose works outsold Calvin and Beza in his day. He was a superstar. But in his youth, he was known in Cambridge as Drunken Perkins.
I love this story from the sources. It paints such a vivid picture of life in Cambridge in the late 1500s. So he's a young scholar, brilliant but totally wild. And he's walking through town, probably a bit tipsy, stumbling along the cobblestones, and he overhears a woman disciplining her child.
Right. And she doesn't threaten the child with a ghost or a monster or the dark. She points at this young man, this future world-renowned theologian stumbling down the street, and says to her toddler, "Hold your tongue, or I will give you to Drunken Perkins yonder."
Imagine that. Imagine being the local boogeyman used to scare toddlers. That has to be a rock-bottom moment. You're not just a party animal. You are the cautionary tale for the neighborhood kids.
It was a huge turning point. The sources say his conscience was completely gripped by that. He realized he had become a byword for dysfunction. That transition from Drunken Perkins, a man completely out of control, enslaved to his own impulses, to the Perkins who wrote A Golden Chain, is crucial.
Because he needed to understand how it worked.
Exactly. He became obsessed with order, with the golden chain of salvation, because he needed to understand how a wretch like him could actually be saved. He needed to know how the total chaos of a sinful life gets reordered by God.
So he converts, he becomes a powerhouse preacher, preaching to prisoners in Cambridge jail, by the way, which tells you something about his heart for the lost causes. And he produces this chart. So let's start at the very top. The circle labeled God.
Or Jehovah Elohim in the chart. And right away, Perkins gives us a definition of theology that I think surprises people who expect Puritans to be dry, dusty, and miserable. He defines theology as the science of living blessedly forever.
Living blessedly. That sounds more like a lifestyle guide than a systematic theology text. It sounds like the art of living or something you'd see in the self-help section today.
For Perkins, it was the ultimate self-help because it was God-help. He didn't separate doctrine from life. You couldn't live a happy, blessed life unless you understood God and you understood yourself.
If your map of reality is wrong, you're going to crash.
Right? And the chart starts with God's attributes. He lists things like simplicity and eternity. But the engine of the whole chart, the thing that drives the mechanism, is the interplay between God's foreknowledge and God's decree.
And this is where we get into the weeds immediately. Foreknowledge versus decree. Most people today, if you ask them about God knowing the future, they'd say, well, God is outside of time. He looks down the corridor of history, sees what I'm going to do next Tuesday, and so he knows it.
Right, that's the intuitive view. It's often called simple foreknowledge or prescience. The idea is that God is a spectator with a really, really good view. He watches the movie of history, but he didn't necessarily write the script. He just knows the ending because he can fast forward.
But Perkins rejects that entirely.
He flips it completely on its head. He argues that God's foreknowledge depends on his decree. God knows that something will happen because God has already decided it will happen. He wrote the script. He isn't watching the movie. He directed it, produced it, and wrote every single line of dialogue.
The logic there, if I understand the source correctly, is that if God just saw it happen, then God is learning something from us.
Yeah.
If he looks down the corridor of time and says, oh, look, Perkins is going to get drunk on Friday, then Perkins' action is determining God's knowledge.
Yes.
God becomes dependent on man for information.
Exactly. And for a Puritan like Perkins, the idea that God could be dependent on anything outside of himself is borderline blasphemy. God is the first mover. He is the uncaused cause. So the decision of God must logically precede the knowledge of the event. He knows it because he willed it.
But this raises the elephant in the room. That question that has plagued theologians for centuries. If God wrote the script, and the script includes war plague and Drunken Perkins sinning in the streets, is God the author of sin?
It is the inevitable question. If God is the first cause of everything, is he responsible for evil? And Perkins was well aware of this objection. It wasn't new even then. It was the Pelagian argument of his day, and it's still the argument today.
Right. We see this in the modern sources like Soteriology 101, which we will touch on later. They argue that this view makes God a moral monster.
So how does Perkins defend this? Because he definitely doesn't shy away from it. He has a very specific analogy that comes up in the text, the analogy of the lame horse.
It's critical. If you want to understand Puritan theology, and specifically how they handle this massive tension, you have to understand the lame horse. So here's the picture Perkins draws. You have a horse that has a bad leg, it's lame, and you have a rider.
Okay, rider and a horse. Simple enough.
The rider spurs the horse to move. He applies the whip or the spur. The horse moves forward. But because the horse has a bad leg, it limps. It hobbles.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now Perkins asks what caused the motion.
The rider. He spurred the horse. If the rider didn't spur it, the horse would just be standing there.
Exactly, but what caused the limp?
The bad leg. The defect in the horse itself.
Right. Did the rider cause the limp?
No, the rider just caused the movement. The horse's own nature caused the movement to be crooked.
And that is Perkins' defense. He argues that God is the rider. In a metaphysical sense, God provides the power for every single action. You cannot lift your arm. You cannot take a breath. You cannot form a thought without God providing the energy of existence. He causes the motion.
But the corruption of that motion, the sin, the twist, the limp, comes entirely from the creature's own defect.
Precisely. Perkins calls this voluntary permission. It allows him to maintain that God is sovereign over absolutely everything, even the movement of the sinner, without blaming God for the moral evil of the sin. The horse does the limping, not the rider.
That is a fascinating philosophical distinction. It attempts to thread a very tiny needle, preserving God's absolute power while firewalling his holiness. It's like saying electricity powers the machine, but if the machine is broken and grinds its gears, you don't blame the electricity.
That's a great way to put it. And whether you buy it or not, and many modern theologians really struggle with it, that is the logic that underpins the entire chart. God is in control, but man is responsible for his own limp.
Which brings us to the next massive section of the chart. How did the horse get lame in the first place? We have to talk about the fall of man.
Right. The chart moves down from God to Adam. And Perkins describes Adam in the estate of innocence. He had integrity. He was under what Perkins calls the covenant of works.
Which is basically do this and live.
Exactly. It was a contract. Perfection for life. And Adam, representing all of us, had the ability to stand, but he was mutable. He could change. He could fall.
And the chart actually breaks down the fall into steps. I think we often view the fall as just Eve ate the fruit, Adam ate the fruit, game over. But Perkins slows it down to a psychological frame-by-frame analysis. It reads like a slow-motion car crash.
It really does. It's a chain reaction of corruption. Step one is doubt. The devil casts doubt on God's word. Did God really say? It's an attack on truth.
And from doubt comes blindness.
The mind stops seeing God as good.
Yeah.
It starts to view God as a restrictor, someone holding out on you. Once the mind is blind, the heart follows.
Step 3 is distrust.
And once you distrust God, you start looking for satisfaction elsewhere. That leads to desire. Looking at the forbidden fruit, seeing it as beautiful. And finally, action. Eating the fruit.
It's so interesting that the physical act of eating is the last link in the chain. The fall happened inside before it ever happened outside.
That's a very Puritan insight. Sin is an internal collapse before it's an external action. And the result of this action, according to Perkins, is something called privative sin.
Privative, that's a philosophical term that might need some defining. It sounds like private, but I know that's not it.
It comes from the Latin privatio, meaning deprivation or absence. Perkins argues that when Adam sinned, God didn't create a substance called evil and inject it into him like a virus. Sin isn't a thing in that sense. It is the absence of good.
Think of it like darkness. Darkness isn't a particle, it's just the absence of light. Cold isn't a substance, it's the absence of heat.
So Adam didn't gain a sin nature as a new addition. He lost his integrity, he lost the light. He became a vacuum of goodness.
And because he was our representative when he turned out the lights, we were all left in the dark. This brings us to the concept of total corruption or total depravity.
Perkins uses a very visceral analogy here, too. He talks about a town on fire.
Yes. He says, imagine a town is burning down. You don't stand around on the street corner debating how the fire started. You don't hold a committee meeting about the fairness of the spark. You realize you are burning.
He's cutting off the complaint about, well, I didn't vote for Adam. Why am I being punished for his sin?
Perkins says, look at your life. Look at your limp. You are burning with corruption. The origin is less important than the current reality. And the reality is that the will, the human chooser, is now the lame leg. It cannot choose to walk straight. It is enslaved to its own corruption.
And this is where the map splits. Up until now, we've been on a single vertical line. God, then Adam, then the fall. But now the chart diverges into two paths, a left side and a right side.
And today we are forcing ourselves to look strictly at the right side, the black line.
The path of reprobation.
This is the hardest part of the chart. Perkins defines reprobation in chapter 52 as God's decree to reject certain men unto eternal destruction. And here is the kicker. To the praise of his justice.
That is a hard pill to swallow for modern ears. We are so used to hearing that God's glory is always in his love, his mercy. But Perkins is saying God gets glory out of destruction.
He is. He argues that God's glory is displayed in two theaters. One theater is mercy. That's the left side, the elect, which we will discuss in the next deep dive. But the other theater is justice. And to display justice, there must be judgment. There must be a display of wrath against sin. If there are no villains, there is no justice.
So let's trace the steps on this right side. What happens to the reprobate? It starts with no calling or ineffectual calling.
This is fascinating and terrifying. Some people, Perkins says, are just never called. They live in ignorance, they never hear the gospel, that's a no-calling group. But the ineffectual calling group, these are people who sit in church.
Wait, so you can be on the path of reprobation and be in the pews every Sunday?
Absolutely. Perkins calls this ineffectual calling. He describes a person who hears the word, understands it intellectually, and even has a taste of the Spirit. He references Hebrews chapter 6 here. They might feel a sense of holiness, they might nod along with the sermon, they might even cry during the worship music.
But it doesn't stick.
It doesn't root. Perkins talks about temporary faith. This is the guy who believes the gospel is true in general. Yes, Jesus died for sinners, but he never takes the step of personal application. He never says, Christ died for me. He never feels the weight of his own specific limp.
It's a generic faith, a spectator's faith. It's like looking at a meal and saying that looks delicious and nutritious, but never actually sitting down to eat it.
And Perkins warns that this is a very dangerous place to be, because from temporary faith, the chart goes downward. The next step is yielding. They yield to the calling for a while, but then comes falling away.
The heart gets hardened.
And this hardening isn't passive. Perkins describes it as a judicial act of God. When a person rejects the light, God punishes that sin with more sin. He gives them over to their own hardness. It's like the Pharaoh narrative in Exodus. Pharaoh hardens his heart, and then God hardens Pharaoh's heart.
That reminds me of the phrase in the chart, reprobate sense.
A reprobate sense means the moral compass is shattered. The light of reason is extinguished. They can no longer distinguish good from evil. They might call evil good and good evil. It's a complete inversion of reality.
And then comes greediness and sin.
Right. They aren't just sinning by accident anymore. They are enthusiastic about it. They are consuming sin. And this leads inevitably to the bottom of the chart. Condemnation, eternal death in hell.
It is a bleak picture. It's a mechanical downward spiral that starts in the mind of God and ends in hell.
It is stark. And we have to remember, Perkins wasn't drawing this because he hated people. He was drawing it because he believed it was the map of reality, and he wanted to warn people. He wanted to shake them out of that temporary faith. He wanted to scare them onto the other path.
Now, Perkins was just one man in Cambridge. But this map didn't stay in Cambridge. It basically became the blueprint for the English church and eventually for the Baptists and Presbyterians who came to America.
Exactly. Perkins is often called the father of Puritanism for a reason. His theology became the bedrock for the major English confessions. We see this logic codified almost word for word in some places in the Westminster Confession of Faith in 1646.
That's the Presbyterian standard.
Right, but then we see it jump streams. The Baptists adopt it.
We have to talk about the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession, because when we talk about Reformed Baptists today, and that is a massive movement right now, this is their document.
It is, and the history of the 1689 is actually really interesting. It's called the 1689 Confession, but it was actually written and published anonymously in 1677.
Anonymous.
Because it was illegal to be a Baptist. This was under the restoration of the monarchy. The Clarendon Code was in effect. If you weren't Anglican, you could be fined, imprisoned, or worse. So the Baptists were meeting in secret. They were what were called dissenters.
So they write this document in the dark, basically.
And here's the strategy. They didn't want to reinvent the wheel. They wanted to show that they weren't crazy radicals. They weren't Anabaptists who were going to run naked through the streets or overthrow the government. They wanted to say, hey, we are just like the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, except for baptism and church government.
So they copied the Presbyterians.
They largely did. They took the Westminster Confession and the Savoy Declaration, which was the Congregationalist version, and they adopted the text almost verbatim, only changing the chapters on baptism and the church.
That's a survival strategy. See, we believe the exact same things about God, the decree and the fall as you do. Please stop arresting us.
Exactly. And that means they adopted the golden chain theology. If you look at the 1689 Confession, chapter 3 is of God's decree. It affirms that God has ordained whatsoever comes to pass. Chapter 6 is of the fall of man. It affirms total depravity. Chapter 9 is of free will, or rather the loss of free will in spiritual matters.
Is Perkins' chart turned into legal language?
It is. While Perkins used a visual tool for the unlearned, the Confessions used precise legal theological language to protect the church from error. They wanted to lock this down. They wanted to make sure that the golden chain was the official stance of the church.
And this brings us to the modern day. Because this view, this high Calvinism, this golden chain, is experiencing a massive resurgence right now. But it's also facing a massive backlash.
It is. The new Calvinism, or young, restless, and reformed movement, brought these old confessions back into the spotlight. But that has triggered a counter-movement. And one of the most vocal groups is what we call provisionism.
We saw this in the sources from Soteriology 101 and Dr. Leighton Flowers.
Hmm.
They look at this right side of the chart, this idea that God decrees the reprobate to destruction, and they recoil.
They do. And it's important to understand why. Their argument is often summarized with the acronym PROVIDE. But the core critique is that the golden chain view creates a zero-sum game.
Unpack that for us. What is the zero-sum argument?
The argument is that in Perkins' system, for God to be sovereign, man must be nothing. If God is active, man must be passive. Provisionists argue that this makes man a puppet. They argue that if God decrees the sin and then punishes the sin, God is duplicitous. They would look at the lame horse analogy and say, but God broke the horse's leg.
Right. They would say if God created the horse lame or decreed the horse would become lame, he can't blame it for limping. Now, again, we're just looking at the source material here, letting you decide which framework makes sense. But that is a powerful pushback.
Exactly. Provisionists argue for a libertarian free will, that man has the genuine ability to accept or reject the gospel, and that God's decree doesn't lock people into the right side of the chart before they are born. They argue that God desires all to be saved, not just the elect on the left side. They focus heavily on verses that say God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked.
It's a fundamental clash of worldviews. Perkins sees the universe as a script written by God for his glory, where even the villains play a necessary role. Provisionists see it as a relationship where God provides the opportunity, but the choice is truly ours.
And Perkins anticipated this. That's the irony. He was fighting the Pelagians of his day who said similar things. Perkins would argue that the provisionist view robs God of his glory. He would say if you are the one who decides to accept the gospel, if you are the tiebreaker, then you have something to boast about. You are the rider of your own horse.
Perkins would say that makes salvation dependent on a lame will.
Exactly. He would say your leg is broken, you can't choose to walk to God. Unless the rider picks you up and carries you, you aren't going anywhere. He would argue that free will is a myth we tell ourselves to feel in control.
And that is the tension we live in. Two very different maps of reality. One emphasizes human responsibility and God's universal love. The other emphasizes God's absolute sovereignty and the specific unbreakable chain of his decree.
And looking at the right side of Perkins's chart, it is a heavy, dark reality. It is designed to strip you of any confidence in yourself. It tells you that you are the lame horse. You are sliding down a black line toward a reprobate sense.
It sounds hopeless. If we stop the deep dive right here, it would be the most depressing one in history. Yeah. We've basically mapped out the highway to hell.
It would be. It's a map of destruction.
But Perkins didn't draw a chart with only one side.
No. The map has a left side. The golden chain of election. The path of God's love.
And that is where we're going in part 2. We've seen how the horse limps. Next time, we're going to see how the horse gets healed. Or rather, how the rider decides to carry the horse all the way home.
We will look at predestination to life effectual calling and how Perkins explains the rescue mission. We're going to see how he defines adoption and sanctification.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? We've been talking about reprobation, hardness of heart, the inability to feel or care about God.
I think Perkins would leave us with a provocative thought. If you are listening to this and you feel the weight of it, if you look at your life and you feel that limp, that corruption, you can't seem to fix that darkness in your own heart. Perkins would say, don't despair.
Why? If I feel the limp, isn't that bad news?
Because the reprobate on the right side, they don't care. They have greediness and sin. They are numb. They don't worry about their souls. If you feel the fracture, if you feel the lameness, that might not be a sign of doom. According to Perkins's chart, realizing you are broken is the very first step on the other side of the chain.
But to find out what happens next, you will have to join us for the next deep dive. See you then.